late. I blame it on Fred's persuasive powers, you know, persuading me to say yes when really, you know, I was meant to be doing something else. Anyway, so I'm really happy to be here, and you know, already I found the two contributions really helpful. And your ending that, you know, you're presenting ideas that'll be useful, I'm sure they will. And so mine will be rather sort of ad hoc. I suppose for me, in a way, the SWP's always treated me as a total reformist, so maybe I've just got to own up, you know. But I mean, then somebody, some comrade told me, well, a revolutionary is a reformist who means it, and I suppose, you know, I'm happy to kind of take that on. And I suppose maybe my starting point to this discussion, my experience has been varied. I suppose I was very involved in the whole sort of Benite project, which is kind of interesting because it's a lot more than Attlee. You know, I mean, Ben was about, you know, having witnessed the limits of the sort of total reformist that stops when it, you know, when he or she comes up against capitalism. Having witnessed that in the Wilson government, he then, you know, became committed to the notion of workers driving change through the experience at UCS, and then tried through his industrial strategy, which was very much based on the idea of shop stewards and workers driving industrial change, tried to connect government with workers' power. So it was a sort of Gortzian idea, I suppose. And I was very involved with the sort of shop stewards dimension of that, working with the shop stewards, so therefore seeing the role that government potentially played, but then seeing that as that dynamic was threatening to capital, you know, Ben got rid of. And then the experience of the GLC, and then experiences of observing particularly Brazil, and then spending some time with the comrades in Syriza. But I suppose my sort of maybe, I don't know, theoretical, but my analytic starting point is maybe that it is quite useful to think about the struggle for the franchise and you know, the dynamic of that. And you know, I always found in debates about the SWP, they were kind of a bit sort of embarrassed by that, you know, that actually when it came to the vote and Parliament, you know, were they in favour of abolishing? You know, if we were faced with the situation where Parliament was being abolished, would we defend it? And so, for me, the fact that the struggle for the vote was a working class struggle. You know, the Chartists were a powerful working class movement. The suffragettes, okay, they included some fairly bourgeois people, but it was a movement for the mass of working people, working women. And I think the point is that struggle is something that was, you know, was crucial, but the other that had a potentially transitional dynamic. But the balance of power, the forces that were mobilised against it, as it were, blocked it, so that in a way the parliamentary the sort of victors of the franchise were kind of plateaued out. The Chartists, you know, everybody here will have read their stuff, and they weren't simply about parliamentarism. They weren't saying, you know, we want the vote so we can all be MPs and it'll be so wonderful and, you know, we'll bring about change through being MPs. No, they saw the vote and political democracy as a dynamic towards economic democracy, towards what we'd call socialist transformation. So the question there is how, you know, what was it? It was maybe talking about, you know, the ways in which bourgeois kind of democracy has become forms of political change and democracy, but without the reality. And just sort of taking that a bit further, what's crucial is surely that liberal democracy treats people, you know, including working people, as atomised individuals, you know, and that's the point, you know. There's no recognition of collective change or social struggle. So the key notion that we have to get onto the agenda in struggles around democracy is the idea of collectivising that, of collective struggle around equality. I mean, once you talk about atomised individuals, then you kind of occlude, sort of hide all the systemic, structural inequalities of society, which require collective change, collective action to bring about. So the challenge to radicalise democracy is to combine the struggle for electoral office with collective power, with the collective economic power. That seems to be key. So I think, therefore, what's important is, in a way, to link the question of government and the struggle for government with the struggle for economic transformation, which obviously in one sense brings up the question of workers' councils and extra parliamentary power. But to take that issue of workers' councils down, not down to, but to the kind of empirical levels of the realities we face, in that, I mean, I remember being in the IMG and, we would always be sort of looking out for the workers' councils, and trades councils were often the candidates, and I could never quite believe it, knowing Newcastle Trades Council, whereas I was an ASTMS delegate. It didn't quite have this sort of Soviet quality. But so that I think what we're talking about is what are the forms of particularly working class organisation that have got that transformative capacity. And I think that if we think about Syriza, the interesting thing about Syriza is that yes, they have no hesitation about going for government, and I mean that was key. That was a key moment, as other people will know, in their success. Going from whatever it was, 4% to 27%. Well, firstly 17%, and then 27%. And the key moment was when Tsipras said, we will go for government, and that's partly what explains the shift from 17% to 27%. So it was that willingness to take on board government, but to do it in a way which at the same time was all the time about actually empowering, giving power in very practical ways, delegating power, sharing resources with social movements. And that was shaped by Syriza's history, which I think influences and must lead, we can learn lessons from about our kind of future, because we're obviously, as Ed says, we're rather far from government, but we're a bit like, well, I don't know, we can make the comparison, but we're, in terms of position, we're probably a bit like Syriza was, when it had 4% of the vote. And crucial to its whole, because in a way I think that you can, without being too over logical, you can sort of draw, not deduce, but draw strategies for now from a kind of vision of how one sees government relative to other kinds of power. And I think the lesson from Syriza and from thinking about government as always being rooted in forms of transformative self-organisation amongst working class people, was that Syriza, right from the beginning, it rooted itself, it's built itself through the movements, through the struggles that young people were engaged in, the struggles of homeless people, the struggles of workers, of the unemployed, and so on. And it was always there. It was always engaged in that kind of extra parliamentary struggle, but in a transformative way. So that now, its work with state workers, with public sector workers, has been transformed to actually be also about preparing for government, in the sense of, building up the kind of support for tax reform amongst tax workers, drawing on their knowledge, their information, so that in a way a history of engagement in the movements as your sort of basic starting point also puts you in a position to be able to think about transforming the state, so you're not in that position of sort of imprisonment. So I'm just trying to think what I can kind of contribute to this discussion. I mean, I suppose for me, I think learning from the experience in the movements, there's a really important distinction between power as domination and power as transformative capacity, and that historically the kind of nature of social democracy has been struggling for power as domination, struggling for power over, if you like, power, governmental power. Whereas the sort of social movements, whether it's the women's movement or the sort of radical trade union movement, was about developing the capacity of transformation, which meant sort of refusing oppression, in one's daily life, in one's workplace, in wherever you were, and refusing, in a way, to reproduce capitalism. That's what one was engaged in daily life, reproducing capitalism. So transformative power was about that refusal. And I think this is a feature of the movements now, Occupy and so on. It's like a moment of refusal and then an attempt to mobilise whatever resources, capacities, to bring about transformation, to develop alternatives. So, I think, and this is an aspect of structural reforms, developing demands, but not just developing demands, developing organisational forms and forms of struggle which begin to give those demands a reality in the present, so people can see the possibilities. For me, two things have been important. One, I suppose in the 70s, was that whole struggle around industrial alternatives, the Lucas Aerospace alternative plan, which for people that weren't around then, was basically workers refusing redundancies, but then saying, and reaching out and creating, in a way, a political trade unionism. I think this is crucial, and saying, actually, we've got the skills and resources, and not resources, but we can see with the resources, if they were in our hands, that we could be turning our skills to really socially useful forms of production. Instead of making missiles, we could be making, alternative forms of transport, energy, conservation, etc. And that built up both the arguments in the factory to take action, to occupy, to take strike action, and the arguments publicly in the country to support some kind of alternative. I think that sort of logic, although one can't sort of repeat that in present circumstances, in exactly this on a basis of a template or a model, but the kind of dynamic you see around fighting privatisation, I think, has that sort of logic where workers, 3 minutes, okay, where workers are saying no to privatisation, but are then saying, but actually, we've got the knowledge, the know-how, particularly if we work with communities, to see how public services could be improved, could be of genuinely public efficiency, public benefit, and that gives us the power to resist more effectively, which is what's happened in several places across Europe, and actually it's one of the strategies developed by Syriza and the sympathetic sort of trade unionists around water. So I think that some of these things have got an immediate sort of possibility. I think that maybe also we can learn a bit from the sort of Brazilian experience, where basically the PT, I think, did have a vision, at least unevenly, of combining electoral power with a struggle to transform the state, through the whole notion of participatory budgets and so on. It was, in a way, they didn't win, and in most places like Porto Alegre and Rio Grande do Sul, the province or the region in which Porto Alegre is the capital, they actually didn't win full electoral power. They won the mayoral position or the governor position. Then what they did was to use that position of electoral power and the party to mobilise the people behind them to kind of outflank, as it were, the right-wing legislature. But they didn't. But when it came to the national level, Lula and etc. weren't willing to do that. They weren't willing to actually challenge the state and use the potential power they had to do that. So I think I need to probably wind up. And I'd say, yeah, of course we need socialist government. We need to fight for governmental power, but we need to be wary of it. I think, having sort of seen the GLC and seen the experience of Tony Benn and being a general reformist, I can say, that really governmental power is very, very limited unless one has not just the kind of popular pressure behind you of the mass of people, but actually you have actual practical material alternatives. So that the point is about social democracy is that when it gets into government, it relies on management. You know, it relies on capital to carry out its policies. And so key to any transformative strategy that we can prepare for now in the way we work with the unions and with social movements is to build up, you know, on the side of the working class, that sort of capacity to bring about transformation. So that, you know, when there is something resembling a workers' government or a left government, that there are allies, as it were, within production, within society. And that, I think, is what Syriza are attempting to do. And I think this is the lesson of, you know, obviously we've all been thinking about Ralph Miliband, happily. And I think, you know, the key point about parliamentary socialism was that it was parliamentarist, you know, it completely, and this is our legacy, you know, the legacy of the bloody Labour Party, and the way that it's the nature of its relationship to the unions was a kind of apolitical, you know, it separated politics from trade unionism, and so, you know, in government, in the electoral sphere, it was thoroughly deferentially parliamentarist, and in the trade union sphere, it was thoroughly, you know, sort of economistic, if you like, and sticking to the kind of division of labour. And I think, you know, this is why people like Unite, without being romantic, I've just been at the tea scene, you know, people like the kind of dynamic in Unite and in some other sort of trade union branches is interesting because it opens up the possibility, you know, don't rely on trade union bureaucrats, blah, 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 but, you know, it opens up the possibility of a more political dynamic, a self-consciously political dynamic in the trade union movement, which isn't simply saying, hand it over to the Labour Party. I think Unite does too much of, you know, handing it over to the Labour Party. We want a Labour government, we'll do anything to get a Labour government. But so I think all this debate has got a lot of relevance for now, for strategy now. So I'd like to draw that out.
Thank you.